Hola, buenas tardes amigos. ¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo estáis? Soy Plácido Doménech y hoy viernes, terminando la semana, que no el contenido, porque tenemos sábado y domingo y hay muchísimas cosas que contar. Vamos a ver, hablar de un nuevo Inside X titulado La vida y la inteligencia son computables. Bueno, es un título provocativo. Yo no voy a decir si estoy a favor, en contra o qué pienso al respecto. Vamos a ver múltiple contenido. Voy a intentar también, en vez de hacerlo como lo hacíamos hasta ahora, que es ver el contenido y luego comentar cosas, hacerlo como lo hacía al principio. Al principio es que lo hacía así, que es, bueno, a medida que se vaya hablando, ir debatiendo. Es decir, que no sea la reproducción de un episodio, sino que casi sea la versión de Plácido, Doménech analizando los contenidos, y en vez de tener que esperarse hasta el final, pues vamos a ir debatiendo para que de alguna forma los que lo escuchéis por podcast, pues bueno, escuchéis trocitos en inglés si los entendéis, y luego a mí entonces el episodio va a hacerse imperdible porque aportaré mi visión, opinión, debate, pensamiento crítico, conocimiento, lo que queráis. La vida y la inteligencia son computables. Un nuevo Inside X en xHUB.AI. Este fin de semana, de todas maneras, bueno, sé lo que vamos a hacer la semana que viene. La semana que viene, bueno, tendremos un X debate con Exodus, el talento, fuga de talento en España, ¿no? Un tema preocupante que ya me afecta directamente, no porque me lo esté pensando, que también, sino por, bueno, gente de mi familia alrededor. Pero bueno, muchísima gente que conozco del networking de xHUB.AI de fuera van a coger las maletas y se van a ir de España. Luego también vamos a tener un debate sobre Sora 2, como no. También vamos a tener a Manuel Alfonseca. Vamos a hablar de agentes. Y también me habéis comentado algo que, bueno, creo que va a llegar el momento bueno, de hacerlo. Estamos haciendo un tema de formación, todavía no podemos deciros nada. Pero bueno, me comentabais muchos que podíamos no solo hacer este tipo de contenido, sino un contenido más divulgativo. Yo el contenido canal, bueno, la formación sí que va a ser para todos los niveles, pero estoy pensando en hacer otro canal de ingeniería de inteligencia artificial. Bueno, enfocada a negocio, enfocada a ingeniería, también a investigación. En definitiva, un enfoque complementario, pero distinto. Quizá con un perfil de oyente o de seguidor distinto, ¿no? Me apetece, es a lo que me dedico, pero sé que es apasionante todo lo que hacemos en xHUB.AI. No significa que vayamos a dejar lo que hacemos en xHUB.AI, además vamos a hacer más contenido de este tipo, pero yo creo que es necesario también tanto abordar el tema de la formación, que ya os diremos, como que está pendiente lo del kit de los agentes. No se me olvida, sé que pasan las semanas, pero llegará una semana en que diré ya está y ya podéis pedirlo. Va a ser gratuito. Y luego el tema de la formación a nivel de ingeniería, sobre todo seguramente centrado en agentes, ¿no? En cómo, bueno, ejemplos y cómo desarrollar con agentes, donde pueda explicar, enseñaros y también aprender de vosotros, de lo que haga. No solo yo, también un equipo de gente. Vamos a ver cómo lo estructuramos, porque creo que es importante no solo debatir, sino hacer. Y también hay una otra parte, pero de momento vamos a dejarlo ahí en stand-by, que sería más de investigación. Y bueno, ya veríamos cómo lo abordamos, la parte de la investigación, ingeniería, debate. Bueno, ya veremos cómo estructuramos formación. Muchísimas cosas sin retorno. Vamos a ver también cómo tener retorno, porque si no es inviable. Cómo tener... esta tarde tengo una reunión sobre ello. Cómo tener más impacto, un impacto global que englobe España y también Iberoamérica. Bueno, muchas cosas en xHUB.AI. Y este programa tiene relación con unos que hemos hecho, que bueno, para mí fueron muy interesantes, repensando la mente en la era de la inteligencia artificial, que como se hizo bastante largo, se dividió en 2 episodios. Los tenéis en el canal y en el podcast, Repensando la mente, episodio 1 y episodio 2. ¿Y qué es lo que vimos en esos 2 episodios? Pues bueno, descubrimos el TEDx de Blaise Agüera y Arcas. ¿Qué entendemos por vida? Bueno, como los InsideX podéis preguntar, y además los InsideX están hechos para también que tengáis, bueno, siempre lo tenéis, protagonismo, pero bueno, puedo prestaros mucha más atención en el chat. Entonces, aunque cualquier pregunta, a no ser que no considere que en ese momento es oportuna, pues la vamos a contestar. Entonces, venga, vamos a... Sergio Álvarez Peláez dice que entendemos por vida y por computabilidad en el contexto de este programa. Bueno, en el contexto de este programa y en el de cualquiera. De momento nos lo va a explicar Blaise Agüera y Arcas, donde tiene un libro que es la vida y que es la inteligencia y lo vincula a, obviamente, la computabilidad, ¿no? Vamos a escuchar lo que tiene que decir Blaise, que para mí en su TEDx ya fue apasionante, en su TEDx que ya analizamos. Entiendo. Esperad un momentín, porque cuando tengo estas llamadas, a ver, un momentín, aunque sea en directo. ¿Sí? 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 Pues no. No sé. Cuando me llaman 300 veces seguidas, pues me disculpáis y veo que pasa, por si alguna urgencia, no pasa absolutamente nada. Entonces, lo que te comentaba Sergio. Vamos a ver lo que hice en una nueva charla de 1 hora y 10 minutos, Blaise Agüera y Arcas, que trabaja para Google. Y bueno, entiendo que vida es lo que todos entendemos por vida, pero no hay una definición tampoco qué es exactamente la vida, pero entiendo que se analizará. No te quiero adelantar nada, pero bueno, en la charla de Blaise Agüera en TED da una definición de lo que es la vida, de lo que es la inteligencia y cómo se relaciona con la computación. Pero bueno, entiendo que la definición que tú quieras tener o la percepción que puedas tener tú, pueda tener yo, que podamos tener todos, que entiendo que también es abierta porque no se sabe exactamente qué es, ¿no? Sobre el tema de computabilidad, pues sí que es más entendible que en este contexto del programa se va a analizar qué son estas 2 cosas, ¿no? Es decir, tanto la vida como la inteligencia, si puede trasladarse a procesos computables, en definitiva, ¿no? Vamos a escucharlo porque ahí hay mucho que relacionada con la acumulación en orden local, nivelando el entorno energéticamente. Sobre el tema de entropía, lo comento porque existe una definición relacionada con la acumulación de orden local, nivelando el entorno energéticamente, que parece de particular interés. Bueno, pero esto es muy a lo de Carl Friston con la inferencia activa, las mantas de los espacios de Markov en equilibrio, en principios de energía libre. Entiendo que puede ir por ahí, pero no lo sé, evidentemente vamos a escucharlo. Es que no quiero entrar directamente en el debate o de responderte de lo que yo pienso, de lo que vi y lo que pienso de este tema. Entiendo que lo que es el concepto de vida va a ser muy difícil definirlo de forma concreta y determinista, primero porque vivimos una realidad no local. Entonces solo vamos a inferir de forma conductista cuándo se produce vida y bueno, podemos a través de determinadas definiciones o frameworks de trabajo, establecer una casuística que nos determine que hay determinados efectos o niveles de lo que podríamos llamar vida. Esto se aplica exactamente igual para el tema de la conciencia, pero no dejan de ser frameworks o marcos de trabajo inventados, que tienen muchas veces que ver con la entropía, que tienen que ver muchas veces con la complejidad, que tienen que ver muchas veces con temas de energía, pero para mí se quedan cortos, no son formas de abordarlo de forma completa. Debería decirse, pero también es verdad que no tenemos otra. Por lo tanto, es completa desde un punto de vista que no podemos hacer nada más que abordarlo, ¿no? Es como el abordar el tema de la conciencia, lo que está haciendo Anthropic, pues ya lo dijeron, ¿no? Es decir, bueno, vamos a abordar un test a partir de determinados fenómenos que podamos percibir y medir, y vamos a establecer que esos son niveles de conciencia o de consciencia, porque ahí entramos otra vez en el debate. Es un debate muy complejo, porque no creo que con la charla de Blaise Agüera vayamos a determinar qué es la vida y cuál es el punto cero que lo determine, tener una definición completa. Pero sí que él me parece que, si no has escuchado nunca a Blaise Agüera, yo me quedé totalmente fascinado. Yo he escuchado a mucha gente. Me pareció de las mejores charlas, el TEDx de Blaise Agüera. Por eso hemos recuperado una más reciente, una charla más reciente de 1 hora y 10, donde se explicará mejor, además con un libro reciente que acaba de publicar de qué es la inteligencia. Él tiene uno de qué es la vida. Y bueno, vamos a ver qué dice, y luego, después de ver lo que dice, yo sí que me mojaré mucho más en si es computable o no. Evidentemente hay un gran debate, que no creo que se vaya a cerrar, de si la vida, si la inteligencia, si la conciencia son procesos que podemos simular o reproducir, que no es lo mismo, evidentemente, y qué podemos hacer y abordar, porque aunque no podamos recrearlos, evidentemente sí que vamos a intentar replicarlos, y nunca vamos a ver la naturaleza de esa replicación, por el mismo motivo o limitación que tenemos a la hora de conocer qué es exactamente, o tener una definición concreta, más allá del conductismo puro y duro. Entonces, bueno, no sé si te he contestado, espero que sí, pero bueno, solo es el principio, ¿de acuerdo? Pero bueno, viene del campo de la inteligencia artificial, va a influir mucho en cómo se alinea ese problema respecto al desarrollo de inteligencia artificial general, superinteligencia, de determinados temas. Te digo que es brillantísimo. Esta persona trabaja en Google, además es un fellowship, creo, de Google. Bueno, es un auténtico... Me pareció un crack que no lo teníamos para nada como alguien a seguir, y que, bueno, desde esa charla lo sigo, y bueno, como nos pasaron la que vamos a analizar hoy, hemos tardado nada en ponerla y analizarla, pero bueno, va a ser un gran debate, encendido, polémico, y vamos a ver, entre todos a ver qué pensamos. Y bueno, en el programa de hoy, el de la vida y la inteligencia son computables, vamos a ver 3 charlas. Bueno, ahí tienes en la primera, o tenéis en la primera, la conferencia de SWC de 2024, de 1 hora y 10 minutos, con la portada de los libros de qué es la vida y qué es la inteligencia. Me gustó mucho la definición que dio, la pusimos ya en el otro programa, entiendo que aquí la volverá a decir, pero la explicará más profundamente. Se la compro, pero evidentemente no es completa, pero me parece que va en una línea que yo no había visto antes, y que se aproxima mucho más a lo que en la que estoy muy alineado, ¿no? Y luego, bueno, he visto que había una charla del Close to Truth, cercano a la verdad, que es la inteligencia en un futuro de inteligencia artificial. Y nada, esta sí que dura 10-15 minutos, entonces vamos a poner las dos. Una que es de 1 hora y 10, y otra como muy actual, porque creo que es de hace muy poquito tiempo, muy relacionada, pues la inteligencia en el futuro de la inteligencia artificial, ¿no? Y cómo no, pues a mí en estos programas también le damos la visión técnica, científica, ingenieril, si se tercia, pero también filosófica, prospectiva, de pensamiento crítico, bueno, siempre, pero también, bueno, el concepto espiritual que pueda trasladar Jiddu, que yo como consejo siempre lo pongo, porque ayuda muchísimo o a mí me ayuda muchísimo, y a la comunidad le ha gustado mucho también, el contraste, ¿no? Es decir, de ver gente que viene del mundo del desarrollo de software, yo también vengo de ese mundo, pero ver la visión desde un punto de vista metafísico, filosófico, espiritual, ¿no? Intentar meter las dos informaciones en nuestro cerebro y ver qué pasa. Evidentemente es una visión metafísica o filosófica, espiritual, no religiosa. Jiddu, además, era contrario de las religiones. Y entonces me parece muy interesante, y vamos a ver si que yo creo que va a ser un programa muy interesante. Bueno, dirige y presenta a vuestro amigo Plácido, Doménech, Espí. que ya estáis cansados de escucharme o no. Bueno, por lo que veo no, porque las audiencias siguen estables y van creciendo poco a poco. No crecen a lo bestia, pero bueno, algo tendremos que hacer ahora, consolados. Este es un programa de la comunidad de Inteligencia Artificial y Ciencias transversales de habla hispana. 5ª temporada, 200, no sé si 5 o 8 programas. Bueno, una locura. Nos merecemos una medalla de la generación de contenido y de debate. Ayer hicimos el de Barbie, que por cierto que os recomiendo. Fue una lástima que nos fallara Pablo Ruiz y Eric Cifra, uno por el tren, otros motivos personales, pero no fue nada grave ninguno de los dos, pero bueno. Tuvimos a Covadonga y también a Jesús, un nuevo colaborador que me gustó mucho, y nada, yo creo que es la introducción de la inteligencia artificial en los juguetes, en los menores, un tema delicado, pero va a ser inevitable. Y bueno, yo creo que hablamos de muchos temas que muchos canales, y sobre todo en castellano o habla hispana, ni se atreven a tocar, ¿no? Bueno, nosotros seguimos ahí. Y este programa está transmitiéndose por X, por YouTube, por LinkedIn, por Rumble, por Kik, por Twitch. Y si os gusta, pues poned me gusta, compartid, comentad, suscribíos a YouTube o a cualquier plataforma de podcast, principalmente iVoox y Spotify. Y si queréis uniros al Discord de la comunidad xHUB.AI, pues nos enviáis un mensaje directo, un correo, y estáis dentro, y ahí tenéis un montón de recursos. Todo gratuito. Vamos a preparar formación que no va a ser gratuita, pero el Discord seguirá siendo accesible para la comunidad, totalmente gratuita, pero tenemos que buscar algún tipo de retorno para poder crecer más, mejor y hacer un montón de cosas y proyectos que tenemos en mente. Y si queréis apoyar económicamente pues todo lo que hacemos, pues podéis hacer un Buy Me a Coffee, podéis hacer un PayPal o podéis hacer un super chat en YouTube. Y bueno, vamos a ver la primera charla. Vamos a por la primera charla, que otra vez subtítulos en inglés, no está en español. Vamos a ponerla. Vamos a por ello.
Hi, good evening. Hello and welcome to the Sainsbury Welcome Center for Neural Circuits and Behavior for our annual public lecture. I would like to welcome a few people in particular. Those of us from the Into Research program, our partners, British Neuroscience Association scholars, and students from the William Perkin High School. This is a public lecture after all, so the talks are made accessible, hopefully, to all. We're also delighted to have many members of the local community here from the Fitzrovia and Camden, but also including students from the London AI campus that Google has just launched.
Bueno, he leído que la presentación empieza al minuto 4. No sé si avanzarlo al minuto 4, pero bueno, vamos a dejarlo ahí. Vamos viendo, ¿no? Y nada. La postura de Blaise es curiosa, ¿no? Siempre las manos de atrás, una postura muy tranquila, pacífica, ¿no? Es como va a debatir cosas muy polémicas, pero siempre es como no quiere una lucha, quiere contar cosas, ¿no? Y siempre adopta esa postura, ¿no? Con las manos atrás, es curioso, ¿no?
7th annual lecture. The aim of this lecture series is to really engage our minds in topic outside of neuroscience, is what we do here, to really stretch our minds to think differently and maybe to think about how neuroscience and related fields can contribute to society in general. And the first lecture, the inaugural lecture, was given by Sir David Attenborough, and he talked to us about the perception of beauty in birds, which was an interesting topic, whether birds can perceive beauty. And subsequent lectures cover topics, for example, about the empathy and emotions in animals, about consciousness and free will, the origins of culture in modern human behavior, as well as the psychology of crowds. And today we are delighted to have Blaise with us, who will talk about the origin of life and intelligent behavior. So Blaise joined us from Google, where I'm going to read to you the various titles that he has, the Vice President and Fellow, and also Google CTO of Technology and Society. He was previously at Microsoft. So in his tech career,
CTO de Google, previamente de Microsoft. Me sonaba de algo, pero fíjate, no tenía, pero bueno,
Blaise developed many different kinds of applications for efficient visualization, but also building machine intelligence applications. And I think throughout his time at Google, you've been instrumental in leading the design of augmentative, privacy first and collectively beneficial applications. I think that's really important to you. And now Blaise has moved on, as he told us earlier, from generating applications to thinking more about blue sky projects, paradigm shifting projects about where technology will be in the future. And you might ask him later about what those big ideas are. We are very excited to hear them earlier. Blaise is also an inventor of federated learning. This is an important approach to training neural networks in a way that avoids sharing of user data. We know privacy is important. But Blaise is also a polymath. So, for example, he founded Artists and Machine Learning program that is a key voice in cross-disciplinary discussions of AI, ethics, fairness, bias, policy, and risk in this domain. And your contributions also extend beyond the technology and industry. You taught computational neuroscience, computational humanities projects at Washington University, and such that you situate computation and AI in a broader context. Blaise is a prolific author, numerous papers, essays, op-eds. I'm going to mention a couple of books, Ubi Sunt, and interdisciplinary non-fiction work, Who Are We Now? So this is a discussion about where we are going as individuals and societies. And his upcoming book, What is Intelligence?, is going to be published by MIT Press in next year. And today, just to close, Blaise will talk to us about the computational roots of life and intelligence. And he will explore ideas from recent experiments in artificial life and how those ideas are informing us, giving us a new perspective on life, evolution, and the origins of intelligence. So I'm very excited about what you have to say, and without further ado, please help me in welcoming Blaise.
Menuda presentación la ha hecho.
Thank you so much.
No sabía que era el autor o uno de los inventores del Federal Learning. Y bueno, está muy entroncado en Google, lo que han comentado, aparte de ser CTO, en visionar lo que es el futuro de la inteligencia artificial, en grandes ideas disruptivas. Y bueno, ese libro, ¿no? Bueno, tiene varios libros, que es La Vida. Este año, dice el año que viene, pero este año ya está disponible. El libro, que por cierto me voy a agenciar los dos, no sé si los tres, porque ya. Pero se ve que tiene uno que es ¿Quién somos nosotros ahora?, ¿no? Bueno, es súper interesante. Ya os digo que vi el TEDx del otro día y me quedé totalmente enamorado, en el buen sentido, de Blaise Agüera.
Tom, that was a really kind introduction. Yes, as Tom mentioned, there's a book coming out next year from MIT Press, What is Intelligence? And it's an ambitious title. I do my best to actually answer the question and not just pose it. The first chapter of it is really about life more than it is about intelligence, because I've come to believe the two issues are very closely connected. And so, you know, as I finished up writing that first chapter, I realized that it was about the same length as Schrödinger's 1944 book, What is Life?, which was very inspirational to me and to many of us who sort of transitioned from physics into biology and neuroscience. And so we actually created a little book out of chapter one, which was quite self-contained as well, and called it What is Life?, in homage to Schrödinger's original. And MIT will also be putting that in their spring catalog. So this is our little kind of Wildcat edition of that book, and it'll be available officially in the spring. And what I'll be talking about today is at least 50% this sort of chapter one part of it, the part that is about life as opposed to about intelligence per se. But to put a little bit of my cards on the table, I just saw this piece a couple of days ago in the Harvard Business Review. Generative AI is still just a prediction machine. Which is something that I've certainly heard a lot of over the last years. Artificial intelligence tools can now write, code, draw, summarize, and brainstorm, yet under the hood, generative AI tools are still prediction engines enabled by improvements in computational statistics and large amounts of data. Even if the applications seem beyond mere prediction, like writing text, computers are arithmetic machines, in that they take binary numbers and perform operations on them to execute complex tasks. They cannot replace human judgment. I don't agree with this perspective. You know, the sort of narrative here, which is a common one, is the brain is not a computer. And I want to question that. So The idea that the brain might be a computer, or more broadly, that life and biology is computational and is based on physical stuff, dates back at least to Descartes and mechanical philosophy and the birth of the Enlightenment. For Descartes, the body was a machine, but the soul resided in the pineal gland and sort of puppeteered the body from there, because there had to be a soul that was indivisible and that resided in the one structure in the brain that is not duplicated on the left and right sides. Julien Offray de la Métrie published this little book, L'Homme Machine, in the following century, which translates to Man the Machine, and basically founded neuroscience by saying, no, the brain also, there's no special soul residing in the pineal gland. The whole body is mechanical and is based on the same rules and laws of physics as the rest of nature. And I think he was right. I'm not a religious person, so I think that unless you believe in a supernatural soul, you kind of have to go along with La Métrie on this one. Obviously, the idea that the body is a machine doesn't mean literally that we're made out of cogs and pulleys and wheels and so on, but it does mean that if you look at the body's smallest parts and its proteins and cellular membranes and all of its pieces, yes, it's different from the way we build industrial machines. It's not solid phase, it's liquid phase and so on. But it is machinery of its own kind, just a very different sort. And I would say the same thing is true of computation. So the Nobel Prize winners Hodgkin and Huxley in 1952 built mathematical models for how neurons work, at least in their electrical behavior. Those models are extremely accurate. Their successors especially, that incorporate more kinds of ion channels and so on. And those are fundamentally computational models. We know they're computational because they wrote down the equations, and they calculated those equations using machines like this calculator that was found in their office many years later. So with that computer, you can calculate the action potential, and you look at the action potential as measured from one of these cells, and the two curves are pretty much the same. These kinds of machines used to be used by human computers, which is what computer meant until the mid-20th century. And so those are the same kinds of machines on the desks of these human computers. And the fact that machines can do the computation, or the neurons can do the computation, is actually at the heart of what computation means. It means that given a certain basic sort of computational procedure, it doesn't matter how you do it. The answer is the same either way. This is an invention of Turing's that we'll get back to in just a second. And by this standard, the brain is absolutely a computer. It's not, just like we're not made out of cogs and so on, it is not the case that the way the brain computes is the same as the way modern digital computers work. But despite the great differences, the fact that it's highly distributed, that all the computation...
Bueno, tengo que decir que ya he dicho tantas cosas como no sé si ir parando cada vez que dice algo y generando contrapuntos, porque habla muy rápido. Todo lo que dice es súper interesante, pero claro, habría que parar cosas que está dogmatizando y habría que reflexionar, porque hay cosas que, independientemente de su visión del alma, obvia y entra en un mecanicismo puro, y esto no es cierto. Pero bueno, tampoco quiero cargarme la charla tan rápido. Decir que el cerebro es un ordenador o un computador sería muy debatible, ¿no? Para mí no es correcto, pero bueno, vamos a dejar que siga.
happens in 85 billion neurons in your head rather than on a processor that has a separate memory and so on, doesn't change the fact that it's computational.
Cuidado, una cosa que quiero puntualizar. A ver, puede ser que el cerebro o el sistema neuronal inteligente, holístico del ser humano pueda asimilarse a un ordenador, no de forma completa, pero una analogía, ¿de acuerdo? Pero eso no significa que nosotros seamos solo eso. Y de ahí tenemos que ir a la naturaleza de la ontología de la naturaleza, no, de la realidad, ¿no? Y la ontología de la realidad nos dice lo contrario que está diciendo Blaise. Y me parece extraño, porque la verdad es que me encanta, el tipo me encanta el estilo, lo rápido que va, una auténtica máquina, ¿no? Pero bueno, me parece extraño que haya leído el libro de Rödinger, ¿Qué es la vida?, y de muchos contemporáneos de Schrödinger, y que, por ejemplo, piense de tal forma del alma y de la realidad no local. Luego buscó el título de un libro donde Rödinger se pronuncia al respecto, pero bueno, cada cual expone aquí sus teorías, opiniones o no, o conocimiento. Vamos a seguir.
Is what does it compute? And why does that feel like anything? And where does that self come from? So we'll come back to these big questions a little later. But first I want to talk about something even more fundamental, which is the fact that I've come to believe in the last year that all living things are computers in a way that is much more fundamental than neuroscience and brains. Why do I say this? Well, I will explain, but that's why this little book, What is Life, became chapter 1 of the bigger book, What is Intelligence, the sort of computational thread that runs through life, brains, and intelligence. And the way I've come to define life is that I think it's a self-modifying computational phase of matter arising from evolutionary selection for dynamic stability, and also that it complexifies through symbiosis. In other words, computational elements come together and make a larger computational thing that in turn can evolve and persist. And there's a very close duality between this and the way I'm defining intelligence.
Bueno, esta es la definición que, bueno, antes le he comentado a Sergio Álvarez. Aquí tenéis la definición tanto de vida como de inteligencia que ya pusimos en el programa anterior, ¿de acuerdo? Una definición bastante compleja que requeriría pensarlo y desglosarlo casi en un programa entero, pero bueno, vamos a dejar que Blaise siga.
Intelligence, which is that it's the ability to model, predict, and influence one's future, evolving in relation to other intelligences to create a larger symbiotic intelligence. So I think there's a dualism here, and I don't think that's coincidental. I think life and intelligence arise together. So let me focus on the life part first and explain what I mean. All right, so with Descartes, we had this idea of souls or some kind of vital force. Henri Bergson talked about it as élan vital in the early 20th century. And the Enlightenment was all about getting rid of this idea and moving toward atoms and materialism. But there is something missing from this atomic or materialistic perspective, which is, well, if we're just atoms and atoms behave, obey the same rules everywhere, whether they're in a beaker of water or in a body, then what does it possibly mean for atoms to be alive or not alive? This doesn't seem like it's something that can be answered in a purely materialistic way, and so that's a bit puzzling. One answer that I think is valuable and is worth thinking about is function, and the idea of functionalism. This is the key difference. And to illustrate what I mean.
Bueno, el funcionalismo y el conductismo están muy vinculados, aunque no son exactamente lo mismo, pero al final es lo mismo. Pero eso es un reduccionismo. Y esto no lo dice. Y bueno, se carga el alma, la no localidad, se carga el materialismo y va directamente por lo meta, por el funcionalismo y el conductismo, pero eso es incompleto. Eso es totalmente una visión incompleta y para mí científica.
Imagine that I'm a time traveler and I've just come back from the future with this thing. And you ask me what this thing is. And you notice that it's got some ports in it, it's got carbon nanotubes on the inside, and I tell you, it's a kidney. It's an artificial kidney that, if implanted in the body, has a 100-year operating lifetime. That's cool. Obviously it works on a very different principle than a biological kidney does. Maybe it filters using its magical quantum nanotubes or whatever the hell it's doing. But the point is that it works as a kidney if implanted in the body. That's its function. It's a kidney because it functions as a kidney. That's not something that is inherent in those atoms. The atoms don't scream out, this is what I do. It just so happens that if those atoms are implanted in your body, they will accomplish that same function. If you have failing kidneys and you have the chance to have this kidney transplanted, I guarantee you will not care how it works. What you care is that it does what it says that it does. That's functionalism. It is a kind of soul in a way. It is something separate from the matter, but not in any kind of mystical sense. This idea of function is abstract in a way. It is Platonic in a way, but in a way that is not Descartesian or mystical.
Vamos a ver, analiza la lógica, me parece tremendo, me parece que la lógica del funcionalismo no está en la materia, pero no vamos a nada místico, sino algo platónico. Bueno, te has cubierto de gloria, tío. Bro, ¿qué diferencia hay? Bueno, lo que pasa es que, claro, cuando alguien con esa seguridad y siendo el puesto que ocupa asevera estas cosas, la verdad es que impone, ¿no? Y aplasta, ¿no? Pero vamos a poner algún barniz en este sentido. Hay un artículo que he visto publicado por Blaise Agüera y vamos a dar contrapunto. Me encanta, ¿eh? De todas formas, me encanta cómo lo aborda, el estilo. Vamos a ir comentando a la vez. Siento a quien prefiera escuchar la charla, pues que la vea por separado, sin mis comentarios y ya está.
And it brings along with it what used to be called teleology, or the idea of purposiveness. You can't talk about biology without talking about purposiveness. And this is really different.
Exacto, no puedes hablar de biología sin hablar de propósito o sin tener propósito.
From the non-biological world, a rock doesn't have any purpose. The way you can tell that it doesn't have any purpose is that if you break it in half, there's nothing that has broken, functionally speaking, about the rock. Whereas if you break a kidney, then there is something that is now different, which is that it no longer does its job. So whenever we talk about something having a job or serving a function, we're in a different zone than the zone of inanimate matter. And so in a sense, purposiveness is what life is all about. There is something contextually sensitive about that. There's something relational about that, because you can only talk about a kidney having function in the context of the rest of the body, but it's also objective in some sense, right? I mean, either you're dead or you're alive, and if the kidney doesn't work, you're gonna die. It's not a matter of opinion. And also symbiosis is really important to this picture, because obviously the kidney doesn't survive very long outside the body either. They depend on each other. So function always comes with this idea of something functioning with something else. Just like plants and people, have this symbiotic relationship where the one breathes in carbon dioxide and breathes out oxygen and vice versa. They serve functions for each other. Things only serve functions when there are other things that also serve functions that they're serving those functions for. And it's a big loop of symbioses that defines biospheres. This functional perspective is interesting, and it's been explored by some philosophers in the following way. Suppose that you take one of Hodgkin and Huxley's simulations of a neuron with all of its correct electrical activations and so on, and you plug it in to the inputs and outputs of another neuron somewhere in your brain, so that the signal is routed to the computer, which does the same calculations, then routed back in. The question is, can you tell the difference? Well, no, I don't think you can tell the difference. But that then raises a very interesting sort of ship of Theseus question, which is, okay, replace 1 million neurons instead of one neuron. Or how about all of them? Can you tell the difference now? Is it like there's some consciousness dial that is going to turn off? I think the answer is no. The whole point of functionalism is that you can replace something that functions the same way with something else, and if it does the same job, the rest of the system doesn't care. And life works.
Pero eso es un dogma, lo que acaba de decir es un dogma, pero vamos, a científico otra vez. Es decir, que al final, tú al final lo ves como una función, y si te aplica el mismo resultado o consigue el mismo resultado, incluso si falla una pieza la sustituyes por otra, pero si consigue el mismo resultado, para ti es lo mismo. Funcionalismo. Materialismo no, pero bueno, es es que no es ni cientificismo. A ver, el conductismo se puede abordar desde el punto de vista que tú entiendas las limitaciones de eso. Y en la inteligencia artificial vamos a abordar muchos temas a la hora de replicar fenómenos que experimentamos, vemos o juzgamos de una forma conductista o funcionalista, que no es lo mismo. Pero de ahí a dogmatizar que a mí me da igual si me da el resultado es esto y punto, bueno, eso no es lo que dice la ciencia, ¿eh?
That way at every scale. Even if you think about things like metabolism inside a single cell, there is an aerobic pathway and an anaerobic pathway. They both generate ATP, and the fact that one can substitute for the other under the right, when needed, when say you're exercising really hard and you don't have time to breathe enough to run the aerobic pathway, that is because whenever you have a situation in which there's a functional requirement, life is resourceful. It tends to generate multiple pathways or multiple mechanisms in order to serve the same function. So, you know, this functional view of life is the one that I subscribe to. And it's also the one that both Turing and von Neumann were key developers of. They were both functionalists as well. For Turing, the entire idea of computation arises from function. In this case, it's mathematical function, but the meaning is literally exactly the same thing. In other words, if you have a mathematical function, then you can implement it with computations that work on all kinds of different platforms. It could be rods and pulleys. It could be cogs, like the steampunk computer that Babbage almost built in the 19th century, or it could be a digital computer or something else, or it could be a bunch of ladies with calculators, doing their sort of kilowatts of computation as they did in the mid-20th century. It doesn't matter. It's the same computation. This idea of function being separate from implementation is core to Turing's idea. And von Neumann, another great polymath from the mid-20th century, extended these ideas to the realm of life. So some of you may be familiar with the Turing machine, which is Turing's mathematical abstraction that involves a tape with a head that moves back and forth on the tape, reading and writing symbols, and can do any kind of computation that can be performed. This is an abstract mathematical machine, which in this case somebody actually went and built, that can do any computation given enough tape and enough time. But of course, our computers and people working on pen and paper, any of those can do the same thing. When Turing wrote about the imitation game, or the Turing test, as it's now called, in which you imagine that a person can test whether a machine is a person or not, or has achieved intelligence or not, or consciousness or not, even by interacting over chat with and the goal is, like, can you tell whether it's a person or a machine on the other side? This is functionalism too. So I think there's a deep connection between the imitation game and the original formulation of computation according to Turing. These are both just demonstrations of functionalism. One of them in the case of basic computations, and the other one in the case of what people do. I think...
Pero ahí Turing, vamos a ver, es que, bueno, justamente por eso lo propone Turing, porque ahí muestra la dualidad entre una cosa que aparenta ser y es, y lo que intenta reflexionar es sobre la esencia del pensamiento humano, si se puede replicar. No, evidentemente, reducir el pensamiento humano a un funcionalismo a través del test de Turing. Yo creo que lo ha interpretado al revés. Vamos, yo me estoy quedando un poco loco. Me gusta más el TDX, pero bueno, a ver, me parece brillante y me parece genial cómo los pone y lo rápido, y al final es una auténtica locura. Pero sé que va a generar mucha polémica. Voy a ir viendo lo que decís en el chat. Dice Antonio Bello... totalmente, contradicción total. Sí, yo es que veo que, bueno, sería idealismo entonces. Lo mismo te dice que el propósito emerge y ya está. Es que es eso. Escucha, no. En el libro de Human X que estoy escribiendo, es que es muy delicado todo esto. Hay gente que lo aborda de una manera muy distinta. Es que no sé, tengo el libro por aquí. Bueno, yo os buscaré el libro mañana. Pero sí que lo aborda de una forma muy distinta y yo creo que más realista y científica. Bueno, este va dando saltos lógicos a una velocidad que entiendo que los libros lo fundamentará más, pero vamos, esa vinculación entre propósito y lógica, y que eso, bueno, eso evidentemente es más platónico que místico, y aquí queda esto y el alma me la cargo. Bueno, pues perfecto. La realidad local ni lo pienso, ni lo juzgo. Bueno, acabo con Antonio Bello y luego con Sergio Álvarez leo. Dice Antonio Bello, pero es que la función entonces es lo que tú quieras, exactamente. Y si lo replicas, pues es lo que tú quieras también. Bueno, es un proceso, Antonio. Imaginemos un proceso de información o un fenómeno X que puedes medir, que ahí hay un sesgo subjetivo, pero bueno, siempre que lo repliques, pues bueno, es lo mismo, ¿no? Entiendo que la replicación de un sistema, un proceso complejo, bueno, será más complicado, ¿no? Pero bueno, estoy en línea de lo que tú comentas. La calculadora calcula. Lo que al final lo ven es, bueno, si la calculadora calcula, lo que hace cálculos es una calculadora. Me da igual que hayan hormigas que estén, o personas, o gente, todo es una calculadora. No, eso no es así. Sí, pero calcula ya, pero no es. Son cálculos, pero no una calculadora. ¿Qué hace que sea una calculadora? Pues ahí hay mucho más que ver. Claro, el cerebro calcula, la calculadora y el cerebro son lo mismo porque realizan la misma función. Sí, pero es que, bueno, de todas maneras, Antonio, cuidado con esto. Tienes toda la razón y estoy contigo, pero es lo que vamos a aplicar. En inteligencia artificial es lo que se va a aplicar, porque no se puede determinar. A ver, no se sabe lo que es la inteligencia, la conciencia, la vida. No se tiene ni idea. Entonces, evidentemente, lo que hacemos es una fenomenología, un estudio del fenómeno, de la función, bueno, si tiene esta conducta o este comportamiento, entiendo que es, ¿no? Inteligente, pero bueno, bajo ese propósito, estas IAs ya serían inteligentes a un nivel ya humano hace tiempo, y eso es lo que hay que analizar, sin volverse loco, ¿no? Sin volver, no, son números, no, es un camino de pensamiento que es complicado, pero siempre entendiendo que partimos de una limitación y es que nunca vamos a saber. Nunca, Carl Friston lo dice. Lo vamos a determinar, pero no vamos a saber si hemos creado conciencia. Pero lo vamos a determinar. Entonces, lo que tú dices, Antonio, tiene razón, pero va a ser así. Entonces, como va a ser así, hay que tener mucho cuidado. Porque entonces es, como bien dices tú, lo que tú quieras. Y entonces ya ahí entramos, imaginad en temas tan delicados como la conciencia, el alma. No, esto no hay alma y aquí ni religión. Bueno, es lo que nos faltaba. Vamos a un mundo de no trascendencia, de localidad de videojuego que está destruyendo el ser humano y ahora vamos a esto. No. Va a ser que no. Pero muy interesante que se abra ese debate y que participéis y que así me gusta. Estemos de acuerdo o no, que nadie se vuelva loco. Nada personal, todo esto es un debate intelectual, pensamiento crítico, de ideas, de gente con neuronas abordando cosas y ya está. Sergio Álvarez. Un problema fundamental del enfoque local materialista es que inevitablemente aparece la necesidad de una emergencia. Bueno, pero que no es incompatible el tema de la emergencia, que para mí es existente, con el tema de la no con el tema de la no localidad. Claro, lo que pasa es que si tú lo reduces todo a la localidad y a la emergencia, esto se contrapone a una perspectiva en la cual los objetos físicos son elementos inducidos por la conjunción de una idea de no localidad. Perdón, es que se corta. Esto se contrapone a una perspectiva en la cual los objetos físicos son elementos inducidos por la conjunción de una idea de no localidad y un principio de individuación que parecen operar segmentando aquello que emerge de la fuente de la no localidad, aunque la capacidad de individualizar pudiera ser fundamentalmente indisociable de esa fuente de no localidad. Supongo que también se ha cortado, pero bueno, estoy muy alineado a lo que estás diciendo. Totalmente. Claro. Es que sin esa reflexión, claro, hay algunas cosas pero sin... claro, si nos obviamos de la ontología de la realidad o lo que sabemos de ella, porque no va a ser completa, lo que sabemos contradice lo que está diciendo Blaise. Entonces, a ver, es indisociable de la no localidad para mí. Es decir, la localidad no puede verse separada de lo no local. Ahí hay una influencia, obviamente. Información cuántica. Que eso detrás de esa información cuántica hay una conciencia. Bueno, yo lo dije, todo lo que existe en la no localidad es lo que llamo conciencia, no consciencia. Ahora, lo que deriva después de lo que es un concepto de alma o más allá, bueno, si lo llevamos a un funcionalismo, como dirían ellos, y como dice Antonio, puede ser lo que yo quiera, lo podemos llevar a lo que hemos hecho como seres humanos, a un terreno religioso espiritual, preguntando por nuestro origen o por la esencia de la realidad o la simulación, etcétera. Y evidentemente la ciencia cada vez se aproxima más a esa visión que a la que está aquí proporcionando Blaise, que es totalmente reduccionista, materialista, por mucho que diga que es funcionalismo, y para mí acientífica. Pero bueno, seguro que habrá gente que dirá lo contrario, pero aquí también no es cuestión de opiniones. La calculadora no tiene sentimientos, es la diferencia. Claro, porque es una experiencia subjetiva que queda fuera de la ciencia, la no localidad. Bueno, exacto, Antonio. Es decir, es que hay un límite en aquello que no podemos determinar que entra dentro del concepto de creencia, fe, intuición. Y bueno, eso no es totalmente una experiencia, como bien dices, subjetiva. Y ahí la ciencia no entra. Pero es que esta gente entra. Y eso no puede ser así. Ahora, tienen que entrar. ¿Por qué? Porque estamos desarrollando la replicación de todo eso. Y entonces, aquellos que creamos en lo que comentáis, conciencia, experiencia subjetiva, no localidad, alma o lo que queráis ir más allá, hay que generar una narrativa que contraponga todas estas mentiras, estos dogmas. Porque nos lleva entonces a una localidad, a una gamificación, el ser humano como, como una entidad, vamos, ¿cómo se llama? Cibernética, no me acuerdo cómo se llama el nombre, mecanicista, eso, totalmente mecanicista. Vamos, donde la no localidad, me olvido de ella, vamos. Bueno, me gusta mucho, pero...
I think that's right. And I think
No sé
this
si voy a comprar
question
los
and
libros.
machines thing can indeed only
Los
be
compraré,
answered
los compraré.
functionally, in exactly the same way that you can answer any other computational sort of question. So that's functionalism. The question is, why does life compute? Well, this is where we get to von Neumann. So during the work that he did at Los Alamos with Stan Ulam in the 1940s, he developed this idea of cellular automata, which is an alternative mechanism for computation, and one in which the computation takes place in a physical world. So he's kind of
Sí, pero vamos a ver, entiendo que lo va a decir, pero von Neumann con las teorías o su arquitectura von Neumann y con el self-reproducing, donde dice que tiene que haber un constructor universal. ¿De dónde sale ese constructor universal? ¿Bajo qué propósito? Claro, si tú cortas desde un punto, claro, sí que es todo lo que está diciendo, pero a ver, tú parte del origen de lo que decía von Neumann, con el constructor universal y de dónde surge. Hombre, a partir de tener el constructor universal todo se explica. Y entonces puede ser lo que tú quieras. Pero claro, es que escoger la película por el episodio o la serie por el episodio 7 o el 10. Y del 10 al 12, no, ni el 14, ni el 15, ni el 16.
Designed a physics that happens in grid worlds where everything is everything is pixels. The pixels do these very elementary operations and can communicate with their neighbors. And if you set up the rules of such a grid world in the right way, then you can make a system that is Turing complete. But what is cool about that is that Turing complete meaning it can implement an arbitrary computation just like a Turing machine. What's cool about it is that in this case the computation and the physical world are one and the same. So it's not just an abstract mathematical machine, but it's a computation taking place in this kind of two-dimensional grid world. And he then asked the following question: all right, suppose you have a world like this, like these grid worlds. How do you make a thing that can make copies of itself, that can reproduce? The way he talked about this in more biological terms is, imagine you have a robot that is made out of Legos. There weren't Legos, but whatever. A robot made out of Legos, and it's paddling around on a pond on which there are lots of Legos, of loose Legos floating around. And its job is to assemble all of the Legos into a copy of itself. How can that be done? How can that be achieved? It seems a little bit paradoxical. It's a bit like, lifting yourself up by your own bootstraps to make something just as complex as you yourself are. But he realized that there was a way to do this. And what it involved is taking a tape, just like Turing's tapes, that contains instructions for building yourself. In other words, step by step, take this Lego piece, that Lego piece, plug them together, and so on. And so you would need to have the instructions on a tape. You would need to have a machine A that can follow the instructions on that tape and progressively assemble whatever the tape says to build. And you would need to have a machine B that would copy the tape, assuming that the tape itself is also made out of Lego pieces. So the insight is that if the instructions for building machine A and machine B are also on the tape, you now have a self-reproducing system. And moreover, you have a self-reproducing system that is evolvable, because any change made on the tape is now heritable by the next generation. So he wrote all of this and predicted how all of this worked years before the structure and function of DNA were discovered by Watson and Crick. But he got it exactly right. Of course, DNA is the tape in question. the ribosomes are machine A, and the instructions for building them are indeed on the DNA, and DNA polymerase is machine B, and the instructions for building that are on the tape too. So he called it exactly. And the point is, machine A is a Turing machine. It's literally a computer. You need a computer in order to be able to build a copy of yourself. Computation is at the heart of what is necessary in order for something to reproduce itself. And our ribosomes and our DNA and so on are, in that sense, a computer. And it's, that's kind of trivially provable in his paper. So you can't reproduce without computation, at least in any non-trivial sense. You can, if you have a seed crystal that can act as a template for more of itself, you can crystallize more crystal. But if you're more complex than what can be expressed right on, what can be templatized essentially right on your surface, then you need a tape like this. You need instructions, and you need a Turing machine to follow the instructions on the tape. So this brings us to a paper that my team and I published in June of this past year in the field of artificial life, which is all about how do you take computational environments and think about life evolving in those computational environments. There's been a lot of work in artificial life really ever since the very first computers, but as far as I know, we were the first to actually get life in a computational system to evolve from scratch, as opposed to seeding it with programs and then watching them evolve sort of iteratively from those seeded programs that can already reproduce in some way. So here's how we did it. We began with, so this is self-replication appearing de novo in an environment. We used a programming language. I have to apologize, especially to the high school students in the room, but we used a language called brainfuck. I didn't name it. This was invented by Urban Müller, a computer scientist and a physicist in the 1990s, who was also an amateur juggler. And the reason that we used brainfuck to do this is because it's a very minimal Turing complete language. It has only 8 instructions, and it works very much like a classical Turing machine. So these are the eight instructions, and this program that you're seeing here will print out "Hello World." So what do the 8 instructions do? It's based on this idea of a tape head, and the first instruction moves the tape head 1 step to the right. The second one moves it 1 step to the left. The plus increments the value at the tape head, adds 1 to it. The next one decrements the value at the tape head. One of them prints the value of the tape head to the console. There's a console in this thing. The other one inputs and then the value from the console into wherever the tape head is. And the final 2 instructions, open square bracket and close square bracket, are there for looping or conditional execution. So at the open square bracket, for those of you who code, if the value at the tape head is 0, it will jump to the matching close bracket. And at the close bracket, if the value under the tape head is non-zero, it will jump back to the matching open bracket. That's it. That's the entire instruction set of brainfuck. And you can write Windows or whatever in that if you're patient enough. I'm not. Okay, so here's the experiment. So the way I called the experiment BFF, where the first BF stands for brainfuck, and the third letter is an exercise to the listener, I guess. So the way it works is that you start off with a soup of random tapes. So random bytes. And the tapes are going to be of length 64, so these will be quite short programs. And since there are only 8 instructions, actually there are only 7 instructions in our version of it, because there's no print and input. Everything is actually self-referential, like in von Neumann's systems. The reading and writing all happens within the tape too. So the way it works is you have a soup, in this case of 8,192 of these length 64 tapes. You fish 2 of them out at random. You stick them together, so you now have 128 bytes, and you run. And then you pull them back apart, and you put them back in the soup, and that's it. We also added mutation. So cosmic rays shoot down, and once in a while they randomly will flip a byte to some other random value. And that's it, and we just repeat. Pick 2 up, run, put them back in, keep going. So in the beginning, as you can see, I've only printed out the instructions in those tapes, and you can see that it's quite sparse because, remember, there are 256 possible byte values, and there are only 8 instructions, so only 1 in 32 of these will be valid instructions. So on average, on a tape of length 64, there'll only be a couple of valid instructions, and usually they don't do anything much. So when you take two of them and you stick them together and you run, very little will happen. But what happens if you keep going? All right, so notice that there are 2 ops per interaction. That's just what you would expect, right? There are 2 instructions that run every time you stick these 2 things together and run. Now I'm going to show you what happens when I run this on my laptop. Are you ready? Okay. What happens is that it programs itself. So you start to get these complex programs, this complex ecology of programs emerge, and it actually takes quite a bit of reverse engineering to understand what the hell they're doing. So they're very non-trivial, and what's so goosebumpy for me about this is that you see something with purpose emerging from an environment where...
No decías lo del propósito que emergía, pues ya está. Ya lo ha dicho, a través de un experimento, como el propósito emerge.
All that you put in was the ability to compute, right? So a universe that is capable of computation and noise. There's no selection function, there's no fitness function, there's no oracle, there's no external, we're not asking for anything. We're just having it interact over and over, and you get complex programs coming out. Why? Well, you get complex programs coming out because if a program manages to reproduce itself, meaning you've stuck 2 things together, if one half, say, copies itself onto the other half, then that thing will continue to persist through time. Whereas if it fails to copy itself, then whatever it is, it will degrade over time, right? It'll either get overwritten by something else or noise will erase it. It's, these random mutations will erase it over time. So just from a statistical argument, from the fact that only those things that manage to propagate themselves will continue to exist in the future, you get something that, that essentially learns how to replicate itself, and replicating itself means, it's code that has to read itself and write a copy of itself, just like von Neumann imagined. So this is really cool because it shows you evolution working before life. It shows you that life emerges from evolution. Evolution isn't just a process that comes after life arrives. It is actually the way life arrives as well. And this is a big deal because the big puzzle for Darwin when he came up with the theory of evolution is how the hell does life arise in the first place? I understand once you have a replicator that's got, well, he didn't know about DNA, but let's pretend he did for a moment, right? Once you've got a thing that can reproduce and has heritability, we know how evolution works, but we don't know how this comes about in the first place. And what this shows is that it comes about in the first place through exactly the same process. So one of the really interesting things that happens is when we start, we had only 2 operations per interaction, and by the time we finished, we had 1,374 operations on average per interaction. The amount of computation taking place when you stick these 2 things together is much, much greater, and the number of bytes that code for stuff is also much greater. So, you also can see how basically this means that computation itself is an attractor. It's an attractor because you need it in order to replicate. And when you're replicating, you're computing. And so what that looks like is this. So what I'm drawing here are 10,000 dots. A dot for every one of, 10 million dots. A dot for every one of the first 10 million interactions in a random run of the soup. And the horizontal position is time, or the interaction number, 1 to 10 million. And the vertical position is the number of operations that took place in that interaction. And you can see something really cool happening, which is that there is a phase transition, which in this case happens right at 6 million interactions. And at that point, suddenly the soup becomes computational. It's gone from random interactions to something that is doing heavy computation. So at this point, like the fan on my computer literally turned on and it began to work hard because life involves computation. So this is showing you how computation is something that ramps up when life happens for the reason that von Neumann understood, which is that you can't have replication without computation. And for the physicists in the room, the Kolmogorov complexity plummets right about at the same time, meaning if you try and zip the soup, you just run pkzip or something and ask how much information is in it, it looks like what has been called sometimes a Turing gas in the beginning, meaning that it doesn't compress at all. Everything is random. But then suddenly it becomes highly compressible right at that point because now you have lots of copying going on. Now, it doesn't become infinitely compressible, as you might expect if there were just a single organism, if you like, that had taken over everything. That'd be like a crystal. So the fact that it's not all the way down here, but actually at some finite value is very interesting, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Okay, so it's a new phase of matter. It's a phase transition, and I would call that phase of matter something like machine phase, because there's now function or purpose in the bits of it where there wasn't before. Or you could call it life. From a functional perspective. It's a very, very simple form of life, obviously, but if you want to think about life in more abstract terms, then as something that is just based on proteins or whatever, I think this is a reasonable minimal definition of life. This is lots of different runs, and you can see that transition to that ordered and complex phase always happens. It happens at some random time, depending on when you get your thing that can replicate the whole tape effectively, and it reliably goes from Turing gas to that sort of characteristic low but non-zero value of complexity. This is just for fun, a two-dimensional version of the same kind of experiment. In this case, being run with a Z80 computer. This is a microprocessor that was invented in the mid-1970s and powers the TRS-80 and various other obsolete computers. And in this case, every pixel is such a computer, and the interactions are between neighbors, and you can see waves of different organisms, evolving out of pure noise and taking over and competing with each other and hybridizing and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Those are the assembly language instructions that are in that code. This is fun stuff. Okay, so my tentative conclusion is that pretty much any universe that has a source of randomness and can support computation the way ours can. We know our universe can support computation, because otherwise we couldn't build computers, not to mention we wouldn't be here, will evolve life. Because, in order for something to persist through time, it's going to want to make use of those computational resources in order to do what von Neumann said. And I think intelligence, too. This is a conjecture. We have a bunch of theoretical work ongoing to really explore this conjecture. Now, before moving on to intelligence, which I'll talk about briefly, and then we'll stop because I want to have time for Q&A, and I recognize we only have an hour. But I want to address one question that really bugged me when I first saw this, which is, why does complexification happen, and why does this happen within so little time, actually, in this BFF universe? And why does it happen even if we turn mutation off? This was a real surprise. If you turn the rate of mutation off altogether in this soup of 8,000 random guys and you let it go, you still get this transition to life. That's very confusing, because in the classical sort of neo-Darwinian synthesis picture of how life works, chance and necessity, as Jacques Monod called it, the Nobel winner in the 1970s, it's a million monkeys typing at a million typewriters. And when something works, it sticks. When the spaghetti throwing at the wall, and it sticks. But that really relies on mutation as your source of novelty. And if there's no mutation, how the hell do you get something so complex, especially with only 64,000 random bytes, which seems like far too little to put together even a few characters of working code, let alone those very complex things. So how is it that this works even with no mutation? And why do you get ongoing complexification? So the insight here, to cut a long story short, is that I'm showing you a bit of a zoom in on one of those phase transitions, and you can see that there's interesting stuff going on, even in that apparently random part in the beginning. You can see those little kind of faint bands vertically and horizontally. And in fact, if you think about just a single instruction as sort of like a minimal life form that replicates, those begin reproducing even from the very beginning. What do I mean when I say a single instruction is like a minimal life form? Well, I mean that if you have a no-op, meaning one of those bytes that is not an instruction, there is no way that it can replicate itself through time, because by definition, when it's executed, nothing happens. But if it's an instruction, then there is at least a possibility that it will modify some other byte. And if it modifies another byte, there's at least a possibility that the thing that it will modify the other byte to is also an instruction. It might not be the same instruction, but the instructions can sort of help each other. They can form what one calls in abiogenesis, or in the study of the origins of life, an autocatalytic set. meaning a set in which different things potentiate or make possible each other. So basically, instructions form a kind of symbiotic network in which they help each other to come about. And it may be very, very inefficient in the beginning, but it's not zero. And so you can see the number of instructions, this is an instruction count, it's rising on average right from the very beginning, right from the get-go. So instructions themselves are replicating right from the beginning. And that's really interesting because when you then ask, well, what happens if you have instructions on their own replicating? Well, once in a while, they will come into conjunction and they'll form something that is a little bit more like a tiny working snippet of code that will replicate a little bit better than those individual instructions on their own, and then they'll replicate as a group. And then those sets will come together and they'll begin to replicate together. This is a process that Lynn Margulis called symbiogenesis. Meaning that you have two replicators or two life forms that come together to make a larger life form that can also persist through time. And that's the process by which complexification happens. You can sort of see evidence of this when you look at this video that shows the provenance of all of those 64 bytes in a sample of those guys in the tape. So you can see in the beginning, the bytes in the tape are largely unchanged. This is after 10,000 interactions. Once in a while, something gets copied to another spot. That's one of those instructions, causing a change somewhere else. Let's now watch what happens as time passes. So you get lots of copying of individual instructions, and there's an erasure of the dependence on the past. And you can see things get more and more kind of creative. There's more and more novelty being generated right sort of near the present. And there's sort of like this thick present, and then there's a transition to full tape replication, in which you get something that persists, and you can see that there are bytes that end up getting copied to a bunch of different spots, almost like the mitochondria inside a cell or something. So essentially, there are little replicators that have been replicating themselves at scales smaller than the entire tape. And they kind of come together in a configuration just so that manages to replicate the whole tape. That's really what that phase transition is all about. So it's a symbiotic story. And that's really interesting because it means that the tree of life, when you look at it this way, looks a lot more like a tree of mergers than it looks like a tree of splits. The usual view of life is that it's all about speciation and differentiation, but this is actually a backwards tree where it's all about joins. And so I think that what this shows is that symbiosis is a much more powerful creative force than random mutation. And in fact, you can even see random mutation as just being ongoing abiogenesis events, ongoing events wherein tiny life forms of just a single instruction are constantly created. And when they form a symbiosis with something that already exists, that's a mutation that sticks. But much more often, it's a larger chunk that has already been replicating effectively for a while, that comes into conjunction with other stuff and thereby leads to complexification. So this has a bunch of predictions, by the way, about what we should expect when we look into our own genome. And those predictions, as it turns out, are borne out. Yeah, this is not a million monkeys on a million typewriters at all. It's actually a purposive process right from the beginning. And I'll skip this stuff, except to just show you that the number of instructions and the amount of computation taking place in a tape keeps going up after that transition in many cases, because you keep having essentially, even when the whole tape is replicating, there are still parts of it that can reproduce inside that. That tape is now an ecology for further replicators to happen and to eventually form symbioses that maybe help protect the larger thing against mutation and do other kinds of stuff. So this is why things continue to become more complex over time. Wherever life can take root, it's more dynamically stable than non-life. That's kind of the key. And therefore, life is constantly evolving and re-evolving. Okay. So if symbiogenesis is the root to complexification, then when we look at our own DNA, what one would expect is to find lots and lots of replicators inside our DNA. And the suggestion would be that they have been the source of the creativity that has led to us. And that's indeed exactly what one finds. DNA is self-modifying code, just like this stuff is. And when the genome was first sequenced back in 2001, one of the big shocks, one of the big surprises from that sequencing was just how little of our DNA actually codes for proteins. It's like 1.5%. And the rest of it is all this crazy stuff, about half of which is obviously viral. In other words, our DNA is mostly made out of viruses. that have been endogenized or that have burned their way into the heritable genetic material that we carry around with us. And a bunch of it we know is doing valuable things. Our placenta is viral code. There's this ARC virus that has been caught replicating inside brains, and if you knock it out in mice, they stop being able to form new memories. So obviously something important is happening from this ARC virus. So basically, what this suggests is that we are symbioses not only of bacteria inside other bacteria, mitochondria inside cells, but literally of viruses. And the viruses have been the creative force that has driven evolution as they replicate little bits of themselves. And that has consequences in terms of the statistics of DNA that we expect. There's a somewhat different story for prokaryotes, which don't have enough space to have all of this so-called junk DNA, but they have these very large metagenomes, and they vary tremendously from instance to instance. We won't go into it, it takes too long. Okay, I want to take just a couple more minutes before we switch to questions and connect this to a couple of other points. One of them is about what Eörs Sathmari and John Maynard Smith called major evolutionary transitions, meaning moments in evolution when something big changed, like happened when mitochondria were incorporated into our cells to make eukaryotes. Those are exactly those kind of mergers in the tree of life that I was just talking about. And if I'm right, that those are the drivers of complexification and the things that cause life to become more complex over time, then one would expect those to be the big creative acts. This is their original sort of short list of major evolutionary transitions, starting from replicating molecules, sort of symbiosing with each other in order to make cells, and ending with primate societies to human societies. And when you look at these major transitions, it's hard not to notice that they speed up. There are more and more of them. Like these are clustered toward the end of history, if you like, right? They start off slow and they get fast. And the reason for that is clear when you start to think about it. As you get pieces in your toolkit and that can symbiose, then the evolution becomes much more powerful, because the ability to combine those and make something else that is functionally interesting is a function of how many Lego pieces you've got to play with. And I'm now talking about more complex Lego pieces than just the monomers that make up DNA or something. Human eusociality, electronics, the internet, and AI, I would argue, are further major evolutionary transitions in exactly the same spirit. I've come to believe that stuff like AI is really part of the same evolutionary process that led to us, not something separate. So, if computation is used for replicating in a dynamic environment, as I've just been talking about, then it will also be used for modeling. Once you have a computer that is replicating itself, remember, it can compute anything. So, of course, if there is something that it can compute that will cause that replicator to do a better job of persisting through time, then it will learn to compute that as well. And I think that's what intelligence is. Everything is intelligent in this sense, because everything has learned to replicate itself in a complex and changing environment. And therefore, it's doing stuff, it's computing functions in order to help it to do that. It's modeling the world around it. And that applies to things as simple as bacteria, and of course it applies to us. If you're a bacterium like this one, and you're replicating, in this case, E. coli replicate very rapidly, it's got to eat, it's got to consume resources in order to do that. And if it's in an environment with gradients of molecules, like in this case, that's a sugar crystal in the beginning, E. coli swim toward the sugar. This is intelligent behavior, right? It's doing a computation in order to figure out where the goodies are. And they're swimming toward that. We know the mechanism of how all of this works. This was worked out by Howard Berg and colleagues in the 1970s. Very beautiful sort of biophysics experiments. They do all of it with just this one control of, is the flagellum spinning clockwise or counterclockwise, and did it fly apart? So it's like those old-fashioned radio-controlled cars that only have like a forward or a reverse and turn kind of thing. But you do the right computation given your receptors that are measuring the docking of single molecules and have the output of that flagellum, and you'll get something that is more effective at replicating itself, because it's getting the Legos that it needs faster than the ones that don't compute. So it's an E. coli.
Vamos a ver algo del chat que estáis por aquí comentando. Ahora nos hago luego Aunque no estoy muy desconectado de lo que se va diciendo. Javier Art, ¿la inteligencia es compresión? No. Bueno, no son igual. La compresión forma parte de la inteligencia, sí. Es una idea fascinante que se aplica a muchas ramas, incluso en la complejidad de sistemas humanos y culturales, sí, y lo de hacer el zip, un proxy, buscadlo porque estuve viéndolo y es muy interesante para el tema de la complejidad con Mogorov. Y es interesante. Evidentemente forma parte del indicador de inteligencia, ¿no? La compresión. Estoy trabajando sobre este tema, por cierto, pues interesante, Javier Art. Cualquier cosa que... No sé si estás en el Discord, pero cualquier cosa que trabajéis sobre ello. Pero bueno, el tema de la compresión, los sistemas complejos, emergencia, son cosas apasionantes. Pero inteligencia igual a la compresión, no. La compresión forma parte o es una cualidad de la inteligencia. ¿Es una blockchain? No. A ver, ¿qué dice Sergio Álvarez Peláez? La mutuación o la mutación aleatoria o el ensamblado de bloques de vida básicos como motor de la evolución, sumada a un mecanismo de poda, podría antojarse insuficiente como para permitir alcanzar estados sofisticados que requieran una correlación entre cambios para que pasen simultáneamente a la siguiente generación o iteración en un universo con duración limitada, así como para permitir alcanzar la frontera de transición entre los dos estados descritos. En mi humilde opinión, falta un mecanismo más fundamental. Sí, es que aquí, vamos, la base de lo que dice es cierto, pero él plantea lo de la obra de Shakespeare del millón de monos. Que al final va a haber un mono que, si tú los pones aleatoriamente a escribir, van a escribirte la obra de Shakespeare. Y eso no es cierto y eso no se lo cree nadie. Es como si tenemos piezas de Lego y al final se monta un jet privado, ¿no? O un avión. Evidentemente eso parte de, que eso es lo que dice David Dost y Chiara Marletto, que es lo de la teoría del constructor y los valores originales. En definitiva, que esto que dice Blaise es cierto, pero hay más cosas. Primero, los valores originales, propósitos originales, realidad no local. Claro, el reducirlo a lo que él ve y le funciona, yo creo que es dogmatizar, como tú bien dices, algo que a todas vistas es insuficiente. Estoy como vibranio desde hace un buen tiempo. Pues muchas gracias. Sí, yo tengo que deciros que al final no soy científico. Javier Art, bueno, aquí sí, luego Ibranio, a ver, Ibranio, ¿quién es? Un segundo en el Discord. Porque es verdad que sí, que cada vez es más participativo. Ibranio, que publicaste Norg, Ibranio, bueno, luego lo veré, porque sé que... Vale, bueno, pues ya te tengo localizado. Sí, bueno, de todas maneras, un tema realmente apasionante. Está siendo mucho la charla, vamos a acabarla. A ver, con lo que estamos comentando, que me gusta mucho, estamos bastante alineados en el chat, ¿no? Lo que pasa es que, bueno, yo estoy, no en shock, sino... esto aquí salen muchas ramas de debates y historias, pero bueno, muy interesante cómo Blaise Agüera recopila todo esto y a una velocidad, ¿no? Bueno, es una mente privilegiada.
Computing machinery instead is computing that particular function. I've actually replicated that kind of computation with a computer model here. So we start off with fake E. coli and a fake source of quote-unquote food that it can measure locally, and there is some function that it's computing that maps that measurement to a run or tumble single bit in just the same way that real bacteria do. And when you do that, you find, again, without imposing any external fitness function other than if you run out of energy, you die. These things learn how to do chemotaxis, just like bacteria. They, in other words, develop function in precisely the same way. And in this case, that function is not just about reproducing themselves, but about all the things that are necessary in order to reproduce themselves, like, keep gathering food. So this is why I say life and intelligence are really the same thing and are both computational. That doesn't mean that there's only one way to do it. There are many ways to compute. There are, if you run this kind of experiment in evolution of E. coli many times, you find ones that are very aggressive about replicating, but die a lot. You find ones that are very conservative and that follow the food very closely, but replicate much less frequently, and so on. There are a lot of personalities, if you like. You actually think about this as probability of future given past, by the way. So I've been talking about this in terms of probability of action given stimulus, but the more general way of thinking about this is as what we call nowadays unsupervised learning, meaning that all of the measurements or observations that an organism makes plus its actions form a kind of Turing-like tape through time, and the job, what it means to be intelligent or to model, is simply, given the past, predict the future. Now, if you don't successfully predict yourself into existence in the future, you will have no future and you won't exist anymore, and that computation won't take place anymore. So that future that you predict has to be a future with yourself in it, or else there won't be a you. And when you apply that selection, you end up with everything. You end up with everything that I think we are, including emotions, feelings of hunger and pain, etc. And I would argue even things like consciousness. Why? Why do you get things like consciousness out of this? Well, because bacterium is very, very simple, but even in the case of a bacterium, life is not a one-player game. Bacteria evolve in a context with many other bacteria. And so what this means is that your environment is not only dynamic, but it's dynamic because there are many other predictors around you, and your ability to model them will help you to be able to replicate more effectively. Especially if there's anything symbiotic going on, anything whereby cooperation or collaboration is going to help you in the future. But this actually works whether it's cooperation or competition. It doesn't matter. Anything that involves a changing external environment in which that external environment involves other things like you is going to require that you model them and not just something static like a crystal. So, this is an insight that is also pretty old, I think. Norbert Wiener, in 1949, when he invented the concept of cybernetics along with his collaborators, talked about purposive behavior as being just about prediction of the future. That's kind of the origin of cybernetics. This is from a 1943 paper called Behavior, Purpose, and Teleology. And I think he kind of calls it here, like this, behavior.
Pero esto, llevarlo a Wiener, vamos, es un mecanicismo puro. Bueno, este tío es un funcionalista, mecanicista, que, yo apasionado de Wiener, de von Neumann y de muchos más, que los hemos tratado en un montón de programas, pero me parece esto llevado a un reduccionismo de una forma muy brillante, que hay para cogerlo y desglosarlo y analizarlo y generar una narrativa de contrapunto. Me parece esto, vamos...
is non-active or active. If it's active, it
terrorismo
can be
cibernético
purposeful or
intelectual.
purposeful. If it's purposeful, it can be based on, it can have no feedback or it can have feedback. If it's got feedback, in other words, there are signals coming from its own past and from the outside, then it can be non-predictive or it can be predictive. And if it's predictive, it can be fancier and fancier at second order, third order, and so on. And of course, to be a good replicator, you want to be up there and you want to be as high order as possible given the computational resources you've got. So there's a straight shot from here to the early neural nets, the perceptrons, to the unsupervised learning models that we've got today, which are literally just predicting the future given the past. And I think it's no coincidence that the moment we began to make models that did a very effective job of predicting the next token, given the previous tokens, we ended up with things that could apparently do all of this intelligent behavior. Right? So when we say things like, oh, it's just a predictor. All it's doing is autocomplete. It's just next token prediction. My retort is, I think that's all we are, actually. It's just that we're trying to predict the next token in an environment where everybody else is trying to do the same thing as well, and they've become more complex and forced us to become more complex, and so on. Whether that's based on predation, predator-prey kind of dynamics, or social interaction, or collaboration in order to make things work within the monkey troop or whatever it is. And again, there's nothing fundamentally new in this idea. Carl Friston, neuroscientist, has talked quite a lot about this kind of active inference principle or theory of...
Ya, pero Carl Friston no dice eso. Fijaos que Carl Friston lo que dice es no sabremos, y sí que no descarta la realidad no local ni los descubrimientos de la naturaleza, o de la ontología de la realidad de la naturaleza. Entonces, Carl Friston, ahora llevar a Carl Friston, decir que hace lo mismo, que sí que se basa mucho de los principios, pero no lo lleva a dogma, como está haciéndolo Blaise. Vamos,
Prediction as being what brains do. Hermann Held.
Y habla de la conciencia como una cualidad muy replicable, pero hasta un punto y sin saberlo por justamente ese tipo de naturaleza no local. Entonces, claro, al final dice, este tío lo mete todo ahí y dice,
Holtz in the 19th
adelante.
century talked about this as well. And I'll kind of end with this idea of intelligence explosions in humans arising, according to Robin Dunbar and his collaborators, from this kind of idea that when we effectively model others in our troupe, we do a better job of politics, of mating, of either collaboration or of dominance, whichever you pick. There's a Machiavellian version of this, and there's a nice version of this. But if you're unable to do a good job of modeling others, you're not as effective in a society that is highly social like ours. And Dunbar and colleagues have actually found, even today, that when you look at the correlations between the sizes of the parts of the brain that do this sort of social modeling and things like reproductive success, you find a correlation. So you find ongoing evidence of this process underway, even in humans today. And so, of course, if you have that operating over evolutionary time, there's a kind of one-upsmanship. Right? There's an intelligence explosion that takes place because if I get a bigger brain to model you more effectively, but we share DNA, you'll get a bigger brain too, and now my job becomes harder, and I've got to get a bigger brain still in order to model you back, and so on. And this modeling goes up to higher orders. I have to now not only know what Emma is thinking, but what Emma's thinking I'm thinking, and what Emma's thinking I'm thinking she's thinking, and so on. Normal people with that are sort of neurotypical generally go up to about sixth order modeling of this sort. And we've done experiments with large language models showing that they can go up to sixth order or so as well. Nicholas Humphrey's argument, I'm going to skip it because we're kind of out of time, but basically he argues that this is what led to these intelligence explosions. And that means that the scaling of cooperation happens through what many cognitive scientists call theory of mind, or being able to model others. And that's very helpful if you want to be able to do things like, for instance, predict where somebody else is going to be in 6 months' time, like the lovers had to do in Richard Linklater's Before Sunrise. They have a little hurried conversation on the train platform and are then able to predict where they're going to be in 6 months' time. That's way better than physics, right? If you're just thinking about two complex systems, that are in constant thermal noise and quantum uncertainty and so on, you could barely predict 1 second out. Right, but they're able to predict 6 months out because they have theory of mind or psychology. So psychology beats physics. Okay, and I'll end with this thought. When you have a model of a mind, including somebody else's mind, it's inevitable that you'll apply that model to yourself as well. Modeling your own mind is actually pretty useful too, because without that, for instance, you can't plan. When I get the little thing from United Airlines saying, what meal do you want to order for your flight next week? I have to time travel and think about myself, at that time of day, in that plane next week in order to make a choice. And so planning requires theory of mind of yourself. And I think that's what consciousness is, right? When we talk about, being able to have some sense of self, that's really about being able to model yourself socially the same way that you model others. In my view, theory of mind and consciousness are very, very tightly connected together. It's not some epiphenomenal or mysterious thing. It is literally just the faculty that we get when we have to model other things that are also modeling, including modeling us back, and so on ad infinitum. It has that kind of hall of mirrors sort of effect.
Es que la modelización de uno mismo o de nuestra propia consciencia, eso no es la conciencia. Eso es el awareness of, ser consciente de. Y eso no es la consciencia o enteramente lo que llamaríamos conciencia. Entonces, claro, llevo al terreno eso, todo va encajando.
Okay, so I hope I've answered, what consciousness is, what life is, what brains do, the meaning of everything, and I guess it's now time for questions. I'm going to skip all of this because we don't have time for it. Okay, other than there'll be...
Hombre, el significado de todo esto debería también preguntárselo él, ¿no? Es decir, realmente, en vez de tener una visión tan local, siendo funcionalista, debería preguntarse cuál es el propósito de todo eso, o que sea así.
A lot of AIs in the future. Do we have time for a few questions?
So, Blaise, I would like to thank you for a deep and a profound lecture. Very inspiring. Thank you. So we have time for questions. And I would welcome perhaps the younger members of the audience to ask a question before, no doubt some senior professors will raise their hands.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think most of us probably let's assume not panspermia, but that life really did originate on Earth 4 billion years ago or so. One of the things that we observe with BFF is that when you look at the bytes early in the tape, they kind of lock in and become very, very stable, even as the later ones fluctuate around, because they form, if you like, a kind of operating system that allows the rest of it to function. So if there's a piece that is really important to support the evolution of everything that follows, then it's going to be highly conserved. And I think that's true of not only of DNA, but if you look at and of course, it's not the case that DNA hasn't evolved at all. It has a little bit, but much, much less than say the ribosome, and the ribosome much, much less than other things. And if you look at the structure of the ribosome, it has this kind of concentric structure where the central parts are highly conserved, and the outer parts have been modified a little bit more. Again, a little bit like the position on the tape in BFF. So I think the answer is that if you break something really deep down, then everything goes to shit, and therefore there's a kind of lock-in that takes place with some of those really fundamental things, like the handedness of sugars, which is always the same, right, for all life on Earth. Does that mean that it couldn't have been otherwise? No, I think that if a different path had been gone down 4 billion years ago, then we could all have left-handed rather than right-handed sugars, for instance. But once you've got that, because everything depends on it, it's very, very hard to change or for something new to evolve that swaps that around, because the moment it does, unless it's already complete enough to be able to reproduce without any help from anything else, then it's not viable. So I think that's the answer.
Formas de vida sin ADN.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, I think prions are a form of life too, if you like, and they don't have DNA, but they're very, very simple. And they form, symbiosis is maybe too friendly a way of putting it, because I don't think there's any good prion, as far as we're concerned. But they do persist, right? And if you think about parasites, for instance, that are not self-contained, they require the reproductive machinery of something else. By the way, AI is similar, right? It's reproducing too. There's more of it this year than there was last year, but we're its reproductive organs, kind of thing.
¿Está diciendo con esto que la IA está viva? Porque dice, no tiene ADN, y claro que sí, y esto es lo que está ocurriendo con la inteligencia artificial.
So yeah, I think symbiosis is the answer. Yeah.
Cuando nosotros miramos a la vida en otros planetas, normalmente pensamos que necesitan agua y otros requerimientos básicos. Pero si tú piensas que el elemento básico es la computación, entonces deberíamos expandir esa búsqueda. Eso es una muy buena pregunta.
So there's been a lot of work in exobiology, trying to sort of think about what the signatures would be that we would look for life on other planets where things might have taken a very different turn. And I think it's much too limiting to imagine that it would be made of the same ingredients or in the same environment as us. Probably liquid phase is important because, just like with BFF, you need mixing, of stuff, and that's very hard to do if you have solid phase, for instance. But, in a gas, maybe, right, it could happen. But in any case, yeah, it'd be nice to look for things that are more fundamental. And there's some other, there's some proposals from, constructor theory and assembly theory and so on that suggest more basic statistical signatures of something that is too complex to emerge from just randomness and the second law. And yeah, I would look for computation. And computation, by the way, has a thermodynamic signature as well, because you can't do computation without burning free energy. There is reversible computation, but never mind. So there's an energetic signature and a complexity signature that you would expect to see.
¿Cuál es tu visión de las cosas que no son computables en este framework? Muy importante.
I mean, things that are fundamentally not computable can't be computed in our universe. You can write down a function that either because it's impossible to gather the necessary information or because the computation would take forever, just are not practically computable. I should also say, though, that the reality of computability or non-computability is a lot squishier than the theorems, of Gödel and Turing. In practice, if you say restrict the amount of tape to anything finite, or the amount of time to anything finite, then suddenly the stopping problem becomes solvable. Or if you, really think about a program, and are smart about it, right? You can, for the great majority of programs, you can actually say, yes or no. Does it stop? So I think the result is interesting. The theoretical results are interesting. They do have some implications about limits, but given that all real life computers and all real life problems are in some sense finite, we shouldn't take computability or non-computability too literally. Seriously, but not literally, I guess.
¿Qué piensas del impacto de estos mecanismos en la sociedad humana, en el desarrollo de la sociedad humana? ¿Encuentras saltos en la abstracción en el programa que tú estás ejecutando, el BFF, que es el Brain Fucking, y la F, no sé si es Free, no lo sé. A ver qué dice.
It's a great question. There are stepping stones. There are these symbiotic major evolutionary transition-like things in BFF, and you can argue that those are that those represent a kind of abstraction, but you don't find in programs of length 64 and for the things that I've run, this is a very small universe. You don't find anything like a fundamentally new code emerging. No, I would expect that to be a phenomenon that you see, when you open up the aperture and you let things run in a much bigger world and for much longer. However, your point, about sort of certain things being key in order for culture to arise and to stick. For cultural accumulation to happen, you do need a durable medium, and there's also this kind of explosion in complexity that comes when there are a lot of parts that you can then remix in various ways. So I think writing, is pretty important to get really high amounts of cultural complexity, and so is population. I mean, I was drawing these exponential scaling sorts of things. So Brian Arthur has talked about the evolution of technologies in terms that are very reminiscent of what I've been talking about, that it's about symbiosis between parts. So, a hafted spear is, if you like, a symbiosis between a stone point and a stick, right? And you put them together and you now have new possibilities that arise, right? So stone points are still around, just like bacteria are still around after endosymbiosis and you get eukaryotes, but now you have this new thing that has come from a combination of previous things. And that, of course, that'll accelerate, right? For the same reasons that we've talked about. If those things can evolve and can stick and can symbiose, then you'll get this exponential acceleration, and that's exactly what you see with technology. But also, we should remember that human population, grows just extraordinarily, right, since the last ice age. And there's a two-way feedback loop here. The technologies allow, support larger populations, and larger populations support far more rapid remixing and develop, and combinations of those technologies, and those two things feed back on each other.
Son estas clases de teorías de la mente que estás hablando sobre acercar el fin de la lectura, que tú estás viendo en los modelos, en los LLMs. Una verdadera teoría de la mente en una forma que nosotros podríamos diferenciarla de la forma en que nosotros vemos o pensamos sobre la conciencia. Bueno, a ver qué dice.
Well, so obviously, the instruments that we have for testing theory of mind are things like Sally Ann tests, which you may have heard about, so these little skits that were developed originally for autism research. And the picture that I was drawing here is basically, humans and LLMs being given those tests, and they perform very similarly to the way people do. Now, obviously, they've arrived at that point through very different means, but functionalism would argue that how you arrived at it doesn't matter. It's about what you can do. The fact that the kidney was engineered in a factory and the carbon nanotubes were made without any recourse to cellular reproduction, et cetera, doesn't mean that it can't function as a kidney, like kidney is as a kidney does. So I think I would make the same case for these. And of course, they need theory of mind in order to autocomplete dialogues on the web. Right? If you have a story and you want to know what the next word is, and the next word is like, and Jen was feeling, Like, well, okay, in order to autocomplete that successfully, you need to understand the story and know how Jen would be feeling at this point in the story. So, it's been trained functionally to do this task. It does the task. Draw your own conclusions about consciousness, I guess.
Ninguna. A ver, en estudios de la evolución y la filogenética, árbol nosotros normalmente miramos mutaciones comunes y un ancestro común. Más allá del BFF, la simulación de BFF, ¿crees que esta clase de approaches, de abordajes o de formas de abordar esto será útil, y cuál sería la mínima información que tú necesitas para hacer eso? Bueno, perdona si mis traducciones son de aquella manera, pero bueno. Real time.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, yes, I think it would be very useful to relook at evolution through this perspective. And there's been some work along those lines, but I think not nearly enough. Again, the fact that half of our genome is these so-called endogenized viral elements, retrotransposons and viruses that have baked their way into the genome, is just super interesting. And I think it's like this elephant in the room that has been really understudied and underappreciated. My claim is that even the 1.5% of it that codes for proteins is just the most digested part, that ultimately came from the same kind of process. So, this is still just a hypothesis, but it's one that we could go much further toward testing, and that does absolutely have all kinds of implications for biology and how we should think about it. We know, for instance, that the BOV-B retrotransposon, which makes up 1/4 of the genome of the cow, right, is if you look at that, it looks like lizards and cows are closely related to each other. It's just jumped among species in this crazy way. There's evolution is just so much weirder, than we think if we imagine it as in terms of just this tree of life and common ancestors. It's not just common ancestors. Everything is constantly enmeshed in everything else. And I do think that there's just a world of research to do there.
Dice que si los LLM serán capaces de predecir o superar la predicción del futuro de los humanos. Eso significaría que nosotros vamos a ser cada vez dice, van a ser más complejos a la hora de predecir de lo que nosotros somos capaces o seremos capaces. Vamos, que nos superará, en definitiva. Vamos a ver qué contesta. Espera, a ver.
Wonderful thing about a very powerful predictor, which you can make by just scaling it up, essentially, is that you can apply that to complex systems that we are not kind of ethologically evolved to do a good job of predicting, like the weather, like the climate, right, or like metabolic function inside cells, and or like protein sequences, right, which we've seen like with AlphaFold, right. I mean, that's the same operation. It's just prediction, and so yeah, I expect that there will be many domains, in science and elsewhere, where that kind of prediction is of use to humanity. I would also say, that we've kind of quietly gone from measuring the performance of LLMs against individual humans to measuring them against humanity as a whole, when we should understand that human intelligence, even as it is, pre-AI, is a massively collective and social thing. You take the average Manhattanite out of their apartment, they don't understand how the toilet flushes, or why the poo goes down when you push the thing, or like how does the coffee maker work, we don't understand anything, right? So our collective achievement is so much bigger than what we understand individually, and we're now sort of measuring, LLMs against collective, human achievement, and of course they're not as good as experts at anything practically, other than predicting proteins and so on, but they're already better than most individuals at most things, and there's no shame in that. I mean, I see the fact that we only achieved these kind of these markers of intelligence when we literally started training them on human stuff, right, on the internet, tells me that we're all part of the same system. Right, they're part of that same intelligence explosion. It's not separate from humanity. It's not this alien, that has just happened on us.
Yeah, it might be that we end up being this evolutionary footnote of this super intelligence that we have helped to create, where we would be perhaps the junk DNA, like viruses are in our DNA, for this new entity that we are creating.
The idea.
Thanks for that thought.
Just to push back for a moment, Tom. The fact that evolution takes place by symbiosis doesn't mean that things become obsolete. We've still got viruses and bacteria and individuals, despite the fact that it's really societies, right, that are kind of the cutting edge of intelligence. So one of the things that I find very, very cool about the symbiotic view is the way the past is always with us. The further inside, a cell you look, the farther back in time you look. So I don't think that humans are about to become, obsolete or irrelevant. I rather think that humanity is best seen as a very large, planet-sized system that includes all of this stuff.
Thank you, Blaise. Please join me in thanking Blaise again for this incredible and inspiring lecture.
Bueno, de auténtica locura. Vamos, porque tengo una reunión dentro de poco, entonces vamos a hacer una cosa. Lo que queda pendiente lo vamos a ver mañana. Además, voy a preparar algunas cosas documentadas y respuestas que apoyaré con slides, referencias, etcétera, porque yo creo que se merece una respuesta en este sentido también razonada, y veremos otro vídeo más de él junto con el de Yidu, que son mucho más cortos, pero es que ahora tengo una reunión y a ver, pero sí que nos da tiempo a analizar los comentarios que habéis hecho. ¿Dónde está embebida, dice Sergio Alvaré, en la materia la unidad aritmético-lógica que permite que la lógica de primer orden dé soporte a la computación que aquí se describe? Bueno, para ello sería algo emergente, es decir, la lógica de primer orden. Sería una generalización y por lo tanto sería algo emergente, y es una cuestión de una ganancia hasta que llegue un momento que se defina o se establezca. Yo no lo veo tan imposible eso. Suponer que esa capacidad solo está en una inteligencia fuera de la generalización del conocimiento, que para mí también forma parte de la inteligencia, también me parece absurdo. Pero bueno, es una buena pregunta. Dice Lourdes que el experimento BFF sería Brain Fucking Fuck It. Puede ser. No sé, la segunda F que será, no lo sé. Si en ese tono cachondo, freak o algo más serio, no lo sé. Y bueno, la última puntualización. Me ha gustado mucho la charla, muy profunda. Luego lo que le han preguntado de la superinteligencia, a ver, porque vamos a hacer mañana la segunda parte de esto. Y el domingo voy a unirlo y vamos a ver lo del el AGI, el proyecto de desarrollo de AGI basado en el MIT, y voy a contestar las dudas que habéis hecho en el Discord sobre superinteligencia, alineamiento, etcétera, ¿vale? Yo creo que con eso tenemos la planificación del fin de semana. A ver, dice Sergio Alvaré, Peláez, a través de X, dice, una sociedad que acepta la premisa del mecanismo determinista como verdadera no puede sostener de manera consistente la moral que hoy mantiene cohesionada a la sociedad. Te lo compro totalmente. Es necesario rechazar esa proposición. A ver, es necesario rechazar esa proposición para que pueda implementarse un sistema de regulación social como el propio sistema judicial. Tengo dudas acerca de que seamos capaces de integrar ideas de computación determinista de manera consistente en una sociedad funcional que persista en el tiempo, quedando como objetos de estímulo. Se corta, Sergio, se corta un punto. No es que a mí me llega el mensaje y no está entero. Quedando como objetos de estímulo, pero sí que el razonamiento o la idea que subyace sí que se entiende, y estoy totalmente de acuerdo contigo. Una sociedad, una humanidad con la narrativa mecanicista determinista, que además es científica, acientífica y falsa, nos lleva realmente al colapso y la extinción. O generamos una cosmovisión y una narrativa alineada a una trascendencia y a una no localidad y a una narrativa que cada uno quiera, libre albedrío, alma, pero algo no determinista, o realmente bueno, no es que yo tenga dudas, como dice aquí Sergio, y es que vamos a una distopía donde el ser humano peligra. El ser humano peligra. Por cierto, me ha parecido muy brillante Sergio Álvarez Peláez, no te conozco, bueno, te invito a algún programa que hagamos si te apetece participar, pues me han gustado tus reflexiones, muy interesantes y además siempre pretendo, cuando toco estos temas, no es que tenga miedo, pero me gustan esas aportaciones, esas reflexiones, así sí, es decir, podemos estar de acuerdo o no, pero siempre con reflexiones, duda. Es muy interesante lo que plantea y cómo lo plantea. Bueno, la velocidad que lo plantea, la verdad es que hay que tomar nota o verlo 2 veces, ¿no? Pero es un tío, un auténtico crack. Pero es verdad que hace razonamientos lógicos y muestra muchísima información, la une y hay unas inconsistencias terribles. Mañana la segunda parte con una charla de Blaise Agüera, ¿no? ¿Cómo se llama? Sí, de Blaise Agüera. Veremos veremos estas 2 partes y la reflexión de Krishnamurti, pero voy a preparar de algunos puntos que hemos visto algún contrapunto, reflexión y referencia, como ha hecho él con papers, estudios, etcétera, que espero reflejen la incongruencia y en algunos momentos falacia y dogmatización a la que el señor Blaise nos ha sometido. Con eso cada uno luego después, cada cual obtenga su propia reflexión, pero vamos, estoy muy en la línea de las puntualizaciones o reflexiones que ha hecho Sergio. No, el programa de Sora 2 será el lunes, si no pasa nada. Sobre Sora será el lunes. No damos abasto y vamos a hacer más. Bueno, estoy pensándolo, estoy desbordado. Estoy desbordado. Y bueno, tengo una reunión a las 6, por eso tenemos que cortar. Y además una reunión importante para xHUB.AI. Venga, lo dejo ahí. Yo creo que es muy interesante. Me hubiera gustado extenderme más, pero tengo que cortar porque tengo reunión. Y bueno, mañana, sábado y domingo, vais a tener contenido y está todo en el podcast. Así que no os podéis quejar que no descanso. Y no descansamos en xHUB.AI, siempre más y mejor. Un abrazo a todos. Nos vemos mañana. Hasta luego.